John Brennan, Barack Obama, and James Comey wanted the American public to believe something else. Donald Trump won the election and the media lost its mind. Then the media becomes a primary co-conspirator in the creation of one of the biggest fake scandals in American history. The raid on Mar-a-Lago, it's the most recent of the abuses in a 10-year cycle of weaponization. Contrary to the evidence they had, they published a report making it look like President Trump had been helped by Vladimir Putin, but it wasn't true.
When inflation jumps, when you hear the national debt is over $37 trillion, do you ever stop and think to yourself, maybe it's about time I bought some gold? Whether as a hedge against inflation or just as a sensible diversification, Birch Gold believes every American should own physical gold, and they want to make it super easy for you. Right now, until the end of September, through September 30th, if you're a first-time gold buyer, Birch Gold's offering a rebate of up to $10,000 in free metals on qualifying purchases. So if you want to claim eligibility and start the process, first you request an info kit. Text my name, Larry, to 989898. Plus, Birch Gold can help you roll an existing IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold, and you're still going to be eligible for a rebate in free metals of up to $10,000. Make right now the time you contact Birch Gold. Take advantage of a rebate up to $10,000 when you buy by September 30th. Text my name, Larry, to 989898. Claim your eligibility today. Again, Larry, text Larry to 989898. Do it today. Nearly 15 years ago, when I first came to Washington, D.C., there were a handful of journalists that I met right away, and one of them joins us today to talk about one of the most important stories of the last decade. He, of course, is John Solomon. He's the proprietor of justthenews.com. And John, great to see you, my friend. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Do you remember that dinner we had?
I do indeed. It was a fun night, and it created a great relationship. And I love your show and love all the great work you do, and always blessed to come on.
Well, thank you. We've had a lot of conversations since 2017 about one story in particular, and that is now known as the Russian-collusion hoax. And I want to talk about a lot of facets of this story, and especially your coverage of it, John, because when the herd in Washington, D.C. was all moving in the same direction, and they all seemed to be getting the same anonymous leaks that assured them that the Russian collusion was real, the Steele dossier was real, that Putin had compromise on Trump, and that he was a Manchurian candidate, you went in a different direction. How did that start, John?
You know, it started with the simple thing of that when you first started reporting, my best sources, people I had relied on for 10 or 20 years, going back to the work I did on 9/11 or the FBI crime lab and the problems there, told me there was no big there, a line that later would be used by Pete Strzok in his own text messages to his lovebird. But at the time, my sources were saying, hey, I'd be real careful. I'm not sure there's anything here yet. Yeah, we're looking at it, but it's not checking out. And I can't imagine that the Washington Post and the New York Times and others weren't talking to those same people. And so I've always had this question, why were they willing to report something that we were getting waved off on? And, you know, there is one story in the New York Times, ironically on October 31st, 2016, where they basically write what I was being told. I'd be careful about this. And then all of a sudden they went in a different direction, particularly after Donald Trump won the election and the media lost its mind. And then the media becomes a primary co-conspirator in the creation of one of the biggest fake scandals in American history. There's nothing more sophisticated or more extensive or more damaging to foreign affairs and national security than what happened in modern history and what happened to Donald Trump in the first 2 years of his presidency and what happened to the country. We're all victims. We will never know what history was stolen from us.
Thank you. I've been trying to make that point. You know, you hear some people say, well, it's old news, and just because it happened to Trump, who cares? No, it happened to us. We, the people, right. We voters, we deserve to have a president who was operating unencumbered by this thing hanging over his head and undermining his presidency. And it really did do damage, didn't it? I mean, we're in August right now, which means 8 years ago, I think, is when the Robert Mueller appointment was made. Wasn't it right around this time?
It was around this time. Yeah, May of 2017, right? It's amazing. Yeah, listen, we're still dealing with it. I often wonder whether Europe would be the same Europe today if Donald Trump had a clear shot at being able to negotiate with Putin without the fake scandal hanging over his head. I
Mm.
often wonder what would have happened if, instead of the fake impeachment, and I do say use that word very carefully. I don't use words like that very often, but I can show that much of the allegations made now at the Ukraine impeachment were fake allegations. And I think it's incumbent upon Tulsi Gabbard in the DNI to release the whistleblower complaint that started it. I think it will look much like the Steele dossier when we have a chance to compare it to the facts we now have. And I think that one of the dangers we all face on the conservative side is to view the Russia collusion hoax in isolation. It is actually the beginning of a wash, rinse, repeat cycle of protecting a Democrat over some allegations and then projecting a fake or certainly weak scandal against a fellow conservative. Let me just go through the timetable because it becomes a lot
Yeah.
more clear.
That would be great. One thing that I've learned is funny, John. We've been so immersed in this story from the origin, which for me, I didn't really pay attention to it during the campaign. I heard some things about it, but I just figured it was campaign dirty tricks. It was that tweet that President Trump put out in March that said that he's learned that Obama wiretapped Trump Tower. That's when it all started for me. Yeah. And I'm learning, this is a video. We both stream our shows now. You've got various products and news products and methods of communication through Just the News. We've got this show. And on the platform that we're on right now, no matter who's watching us, there are so many people who don't know this story, who are just coming up to speed. So and we have time to talk about it. Thank goodness we have some time to have a nice long conversation. So give us an overview in your mind of what this story really is.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, it is a wash, rinse, repeat cycle of the Democrats realizing they may have a legal liability with someone important in their infrastructure and then finding a way to neutralize it by putting the Republican on the defensive. Let's go through some of the key moments that, all right, in the spring and summer of 2016, based on the documents I just put out a couple of weeks ago, we now know that 3 FBI offices were investigating Hillary Clinton's foundation for a pay-to-play corruption scheme. All 3 were ordered to shut down their investigation by the Obama Justice Department. In addition, the IRS was looking at the exact same foundation and the same transaction as a possible criminal tax case. They too were thwarted from being able to bring that case. While that's going on, Hillary's also dealing with the email scandal and the clear evidence that she moved classified national secrets to an insecure server in violation of federal law. The protection racket is put around Hillary Clinton. The FBI is being shut down on corruption. IRS is being shut down on taxes. And James Comey brings out his magic wand and magically makes the email case disappear, even though he didn't even have the legal authority to do so. That was an attorney general's decision. The second that scandal ends and those things are shut down, Hillary Clinton launches a political dirty trick, which is we're going to hang a fake Russian shingle on Donald Trump's house and campaign house and try to make it look like he's in bed with Russia because I don't want to have to deal with any more of these scandals about me. Now, dirty tricks are as old as our country. They were made in the 1790s, in the 1850s, in the 1920s. We have a rough and a tumble political system, and there would be nothing untoward or unusual, I should say. Untoward maybe is the wrong word, but unusual for a political figure to play a dirty trick on their candidate. What sets the 2016 dirty trick apart is that it enlisted the help of the FBI and the United States intelligence community. The FBI opens up a case on an allegation it knew before it opened up was being fostered by Hillary Clinton specifically to limit her liabilities in the election. In other words, they knew it was a dirty trick, and the FBI still chose to legitimize it with 3 years of investigation. The intelligence community knew that its career people had come to the conclusion that Vladimir Putin did not intervene in the election to try to help Donald Trump win, that he stayed neutral. In fact, the best evidence that the career people had was that in October 16, when most Americans were making up their mind about the election, Vladimir Putin pulled out all of his active measures in the country, did not unload some of the dirt he had gathered on Hillary Clinton. If you were trying to help Donald Trump, that would be the month and that would be the evidence he would have imposed into the American public to try to rig the election. So the career people have decided Vladimir Putin wasn't trying to do that. But John Brennan, Barack Obama, and James Comey wanted the American public to believe something else. And they took an official intelligence product, intelligence community assessment. And they hijacked it. And contrary to the wishes of the career people, contrary to the evidence they had, they published a report making it look like President Trump had been helped by Vladimir Putin in his election. It wasn't true. And then in the final days of the the Obama presidency, Barack Obama did something that mirrors a lot of what I think one would say looks like Richard Nixon during Watergate. The moment Richard Nixon lost the support of the Republican Party in Watergate was when the tape came out showing that he had contemplated using the CIA to block the FBI from investigating the Watergate break-in. The mere contemplation of using a U.S. intelligence agency to help a political candidate was unthinkable back in 1973 and 1974. In 2016 and 17, Barack Obama and the FBI are already fully engaged in the dirty trick. And on January 5th, inside the White House, President Obama presides over a meeting with his top justice and FBI officials. Joe Biden's there, the vice president. The day before that meeting, the FBI had decided it was going to clear Mike Flynn, the incoming national security advisor for President Trump, of all criminality. They could find no evidence he did anything wrong. The next day, the White House decided, how can we keep this investigation going? And they concocted an idea to lure Mike Flynn into an interview where he'll be tripped up, lied, and they'll charge him with a lie, and the scandal will be there. Joe Biden and Barack Obama are presiding over that meeting, and an FBI supervisor comes out of that meeting and writes these extraordinary notes. What was our goal today? To get the American people the truth, or to create a scenario where an innocent man is walked into an interview where he might be caught lying and put into prison? The fact that an FBI agent saw the American president doing that tells you that it was akin, if not maybe worse, than what Richard Nixon was accused of back in the 70s. Now, fast forward, Donald Trump starts to learn from my reporting in the spring of 2019 that Hunter Biden has a corruption problem. He didn't pay taxes on his Burisma money, and the Burisma company's corrupt, and there's a firing of a prosecutor. What do Democrats do? They launch an impeachment investigation upon Donald Trump, even though the evidence against Hunter and Joe Biden was very strong and legitimate. Once again, wash, rinse, repeat cycle. Then in 2021, Joe Biden finds his White House staff, after he takes office, finds he had classified documents in his home, and near his garage, in his car, and in his UPenn office. And what do? They order the National Archives to try to get Donald Trump investigated by the FBI for documents he took with him. Now, there's a difference between the two. Joe Biden was vice president. He didn't have declassifying authority. Donald Trump did. But in that case, once again, they get ahead of their own legal liability by putting the Republican, Donald Trump, on the defensive using the tools of the government. These dirty tricks are different than other political dirty tricks in our history because they enlisted and used the most awesome powers that we gave our intelligence community and our law enforcement to fight terrorism and intelligence. And instead, we used it to create a political dirty trick. And that's what separates us from all the other dirty tricks in the history of this great country.
Absolutely amazing synopsis. And we're going to drill down on a lot of the items there. I was making mental notes as you spoke because I've got a lot of follow-ups.
Awesome.
But it's critically important also, before we do, just in terms of the broad overview, John, that Congress has oversight on this stuff. There are inspectors general. There are now a Justice Department run by Pam Bondi and Kash Patel at the FBI. What you just laid out there can't be legal. It can't be legal for a president and his administration to harness the FBI and the CIA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for a political dirty trick to undermine the incoming president or the sitting president, since much of this happened while Trump was in office. Right. So where are the legal ramifications? So many people hear about this and they say, well, someone's got to pay a price for all of these things. Where is the accountability?
That is a great question. Thus far, it hasn't really existed. Yeah, there's an FBI guy that pleaded guilty, got a tap on the finger for misleading our nation's intelligence court, the most secretive, most sensitive court we have in America. That's it. A couple guys got indicted. They got acquitted by a D.C. jury. So there has been no real repercussion or accountability. And for those people that I talk to that care about the tools like counterterrorism, counterintelligence tools, they fear that if Pam Bondi and Kash Patel don't deliver serious accountability, that this will not become an exception to the rule it will become the norm. We will go from being the great constitutional republic to the envy of the world to a banana republic where whatever party's in power uses the FBI and the CIA to go after their political enemies. And that is the moment, just like the greatest generation answered World War II or the Reagan era answered the Cold War. Our great challenge in this moment in history is to make sure that there's a deterrence so that the tools of this country aren't turned against the American people ever again. And if we fail, we're going to hand a country off that's worse off to the next generation than the one we got. That'll be the first time in history that's happened.
Yeah. I agree. You know, it's a funny thing about criminals when they're under fire and it looks like they might get caught, but they get away with it. They generally don't take a big sigh of relief and say, well, I'll never do that again. No,
yeah.
They learn the lesson that they can get away with it, and they do it again. All right, let's go back now to July of 2016. This confluence of events over the course of a couple of weeks. James Comey unilaterally, as you just said, without consultation with the Attorney General, who already had her own scandal because she had met with Bill Clinton on the tarmac of a Phoenix airport while multiple active investigations were ongoing to Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. James Comey says we're not going to bring any charges against Hillary Clinton in the email scandal. This is, by the way, around the same time that Donald Trump, the candidate before the Republican National Convention, in a press conference, sort of amusingly and sarcastically says, Russia, if you've got Hillary's emails, release them to everybody. And everyone's hair is on fire all of a sudden. Within 2 weeks, the FBI conducts their investigation into so-called Russian collusion, and it was all fueled by campaign dirty trick that it was created called the Steele Dossier, funded by the Clinton campaign. You said that at that moment, when James Comey and Peter Strzok and Andrew McCabe, when they directed the FBI to begin what we learn now is the Crossfire Hurricane investigation into the Trump campaign, you said, John Solomon, that they knew that it was fraudulent. They knew that the evidence was fake. How did they know that? How do we know that they know that?
Yeah, because in late July, right after Hillary Clinton gave the order to set this in motion, the CIA intercepted information monitoring the Russians, and the Russians had stumbled on to Hillary Clinton's plan. They were monitoring her because they were worried she might become president, and so they're monitoring everything she does. And the Russians intercept a series of communications indicating that Hillary has approved a plan to make this fake Russian scandal specifically for the purpose of getting the public off the topic of her email scandal and other prior scandals. In addition, the Russians have intercepted information that she has a deal or some sort of connection that the FBI will legitimize her fake story by moving into Investigative. That information is first shared with Barack Obama, and then a couple days later, it is shared with James Comey, the FBI director, and other top intelligence officials. The entire top of the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus of the United States knew in early August, around the time that Crossfire Hurricane was being set up, and before the expansion of Crossfire Hurricane to issues like Paul Manafort and to Mike Flynn and others, before those expansions were even approved, that this was a Hillary Clinton dirty trick. And not only that, but one of America's enemies, the Russians, knew about it. That is such an extraordinary revelation. It shows intent. It shows knowledge. And I think at the end of the day, it gets glossed over, particularly in the legacy media, how significant a development. And I want to give someone a date. It's a date. There are two dates I actually want to put together because they have such remarkable parallels. July 5th, 2016 is the day that Hillary Clinton moved the changing of the guard from her scandal to Donald Trump's scandal. What happened that day? July 5th, 2016, James Comey walked out at a news conference he wasn't entitled to have and made a decision he wasn't authorized to make, saying Hillary Clinton is off the hook on her email scandal. That very same day, Hillary Clinton's Steele dossier gets walked into the FBI when it's Christopher Steele, or the information that becomes the dossier is walked into the FBI in Europe to an FBI agent. The changing of the guard occurred on the same day. I want to go to January 6, 2017. I just mentioned that 3-day extraordinary window. On the 4th, the FBI is closing down Flynn. On the 5th of 17, January 5th, 2017, Obama has the meeting. And then on the 6th, the FBI puts a plan into motion to try to lure Mike Flynn into a interview where they'll trip him up on a lie and be able to charge him and ruin the Trump presidency, the beginning of the Trump presidency. January 6th, 2017, 4 years late before the January 6th, the Democrats cry and howl about so much of the distrust that maybe boiled over on January 6th, 2021 is born in the decision by a White House to interfere and meddle in an FBI investigation and take out an incoming national security advisor. Those dates aren't lost. Now, I don't defend anyone who hit a cop or did anything wrong on January 6th, but the distrust that underlies that event and all the months that led up to that event is born on a different January 6th, 4 years earlier, when a president set in motion a very corrupt act of going after an opponent's national security advisor in the absence of criminal evidence. The FBI had determined Mike Flynn had done nothing wrong, and that wasn't good enough for the end of the Obama administration. Those dates are going to live in infamy when history looks back and begins to understand just exactly what the Obama Justice Department and intelligence community did.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that is amazing harmony there on those dates. And by the way, the intervening weeks between July 5th, when Hillary Clinton set in motion the Steele Dossier story and peddled it to the FBI, she was also peddling it to journalists. People forget about this. The Steele Dossier was making its way through Washington, D.C. It was in the hands or rumored about and whispered about to a lot of hardcore D.C. journalists, and publication after publication after publication rejected it, John Solomon. In fact, if I remember right, it was just David Korn at Mother Jones and David Isikoff. I forget where he was.
Mike Isikoff at Yahoo News. Yeah.
Mike Isikoff. They were the only ones who eventually wrote about it in the final week. Like, talk about an October surprise. So let's just, be incredibly emphatic about this. While reporters in D.C. were rejecting the Steele Dossier as the garbage that it was, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, and the FBI accepted it as evidence to start an investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, and to go and get the spy powers from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA court. That's what makes it so extraordinary. And I want to, for 1 second, just point out something, because when people say, well, how can you make a grand conspiracy out of the last 10 years? Let me remind you how often the same characters show up in this episode. So Sally Yates is in that meeting in January 7th, 2017 on the Mike Flynn stuff, but she's also the woman who tells the FBI, according to the FBI's documents, to shut down the Hillary Clinton case. The very first, one of the earliest people that the Clinton campaign goes to when they're trying to get the media to bite onto the notion that somehow Donald Trump is a stooge of Vladimir Putin and hijacking the 2016 election, they go to a guy who had just stepped down recently as the acting CIA director, Mike Morrell. And Mike Morrell is one of the very first persons to say that Donald Trump is an agent or an asset of the Russian government. He's peddling that, and he gets an op-ed written in July of 2016 and beyond. We trace all this in a story we did a couple of weeks ago. Mike Morrell is the same guy that shows up organizing the Hunter Biden laptop letter in another election later, 2020, trying to fool the American people into thinking that a legitimate piece of evidence in the FBI's possession and corroborated by the FBI, the Hunter Biden laptop, is Russian disinformation. That's why Kash Patel opened up the grand conspiracy case, because you see the same actors using the same tactics over multiple elections.
Yeah. Yep. That's it. Right. That's the definition of a grand conspiracy. And by the way, they're also peddling on and utilizing their resume and their former titles to lend credibility to the charges. And the media always goes along with it. Let's go back to January 6, 2017 here, as you just played out the plot against General Flynn. Something else was going on. The decision was made by James Clapper and James Comey, the director of national intelligence and the FBI director, to brief President-elect Donald Trump on one facet of the Steele dossier. This famously happened at Trump Tower. He was briefed on just one part of the Steele dossier, telling the incoming president that the Russians claim they have compromise on him. And what was the one part of the dossier James Comey decided to brief Donald Trump on, John?
Well, most salacious part about the prostitutes and the P incident, which of course, was never true, but they knew it would set off Donald Trump. And then, of course, the dossiers leaked within a couple of days in the media. And once again, something that had already been debunked by that time. It's very important to realize at the moment James Comey briefs that, and then suddenly the dossier bursts onto the public scene, in BuzzFeed that the FBI had already fired Christopher Steele for violating the terms of his confidential human source agreement. He leaked to the media. The CIA had warned the FBI that Christopher Steele's circle of sources, if we can call them that, had been possibly infiltrated by Russian intelligence. And the FBI's analysis team had gone line by line through the dossier and found several things that were false and many things that could never be corroborated. In other words, it was garbage intelligence. And it's at that point, after all that work, that James Comey decides to have that conversation with President Trump and set the president off, and then the leaks occur. I think that's really damning. And then, of course, around that same time, they released that fake intelligence analysis, not based on the evidence, but hijacked. And what is the basic evidence that's driving that claim? The only evidence that Brennan could point to in the ICA, the Intelligence Committee Assessment, was the Steele dossier. So it's used in the intelligence product, despite all the liabilities I just told you about a second ago. That's how corrupt and crooked this process was, and that's how corrupt and crooked the final days of the Obama White House were.
Yeah, and Ben Smith at BuzzFeed, as you just noted, they decided to release this dossier, remarkably with a caveat saying, we don't know if any of this is true, but here, we're going to show it to you anyway. But I think even more insidious, if I may, John, was Jake Tapper. Jake Tapper utilized his credibility, his byline, and the brand of CNN, and he won awards for this reporting, to go public with the fact that James Comey, the FBI director, had briefed Donald Trump on the Steele dossier. That was the story. And I remember challenging Jake Tapper on the air about this, saying, why are you running with this story when everybody knows the Steele dossier is false? And he said, our story isn't about the Steele dossier. Our story is about the fact that the incoming president was briefed about the Steele dossier, and that's super newsworthy. John, are you splitting those hairs as a journalist?
Well, listen, more importantly, the people who were trying to manipulate the press into covering this knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that they couldn't get people to write about the dossier. They had tried all through the election, but they would write about the fact that Trump had gotten briefed about it.
Yep.
I have said this many times, and it's a profound statement, but I think it is demonstrably true. It was first told to me when two intelligence officers showed up in my driveway about 11 o'clock at night as I was getting off a Hannity hit. And they told me that the most awesome powers of the U.S. intelligence community were turned against the American people. The way that Russia-collusion was infiltrated and imposed on the American people uses some of the most sophisticated psychological operations tools that our military and our intelligence community created to destabilize our enemies. You can make anything look real with certain tactics, particularly manipulation of the media. And when I look back at the period of time of October 2016 to March of 2017, you see, and experts see, a lot of the tools of psychological operations and misinformation being infiltrated against the American people by its own government, by its own actors or recent parties of the United States government. Yeah. That is what's so troubling. We were ultimately the victim. We made a decision, we the American people, to elect Donald Trump, and we were deprived of the full impact of his presidency by this political dirty trick.
And his civil rights were deprived and violated because he didn't have the opportunity to exercise the duties of his office that he was elected.
That may very well be one of the charges if we get to the grand conspiracy case and the grand juries there. Harvey Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, said in my show a couple of days ago that one of the charges they're looking at is the same charges we used to use against crooked Southern police officers who used to beat black African Americans in the 1960s, deprivation of civil liberties under color of law. That is a pretty remarkable statement to hear from a senior Justice Department official.
I want to drill down on the Mar-a-Lago raid in a sec, but I just got to follow up real fast. So paint this picture for me. You do a Hannity hit. You drive home. It's nighttime in D.C., and waiting for you in front of your home are they active members of the intelligence community?
I don't know their names. I don't know their titles or names. They wouldn't give me their names. It was a complete blind encounter.
This is deep throat stuff.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't the deputy director of the FBI, but, which was deep throat. But listen, they seem to be two patriots who work somewhere in the intelligence community. They described themselves as birds, so I assume they were Air Force intelligence, maybe NSA, because I now know that NSA was much more concerned about what Clapper and Brennan had just done.
Yeah.
But they basically said to me, hey, the day I had been on Hannity talking about unmasking, that there had been this 300% increase in unmasking of Americans' intelligence by the Obama administration in the final year. That's a good oversight, civil liberty story. And I got out of the car. These two guys get out. They were parked in front of my mailbox. They had their yellow lights on. I get out. They stopped me in the drive. They said, "You, Mr. Solomon?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "What you were reporting tonight is the tip of a very large iceberg. And I hope you drill into it and find what we know." And I'm like, "What in God's name are you guys talking about? It's too esoteric for me." And it's 11 o'clock. I want to go have dinner. And they're like, "You don't understand. The most awesome tools of the American intelligence community were used against the American people to carry out a dirty trick." That was their word, to carry out a dirty trick.
Wow.
And if it isn't stopped, we will lose access to these tools, and people like us, the two guys, won't be able to protect Americans from counterterrorism or counterintelligence threats because we abuse them at this moment in history.
Yeah.
I have no idea what they're talking about. I didn't even know they were talking about Russia at the time. But that's what set me and Sarah Carter on our path.
And that's so important to remind everybody that, because I hear this from professionals in the military and in military intelligence, that they are offended and angry about this abuse of our surveillance intelligence agencies, because they're there for a reason, to really protect us against foreign enemies, and instead they were exploited here for political purposes. And a lot of people back in the days after 9/11, they warned that this could happen, and we put our trust in these agencies. All right, let's move forward to the Mar-a-Lago raid. Sure. Because there is a suggestion that if a grand jury is impaneled and charges are brought, potentially criminal charges, that it might take place in Florida, because the Mar-a-Lago raid is in some way connected to this grand conspiracy. And John Solomon, remind me, because you had some knowledge of the presidential records at Mar-a-Lago at that time, didn't you?
Well, I had no knowledge of what was at Mar-a-Lago. I had asked the president for permission to go to the National Archives to get non-public information, meaning something that the National Archives had not yet released. And that was specifically in his collection, the declassified documents that he signed and were supposed to release on January 20th, 2021, his last day in office. Unfortunately, the FBI scooped those documents up. It prevented them from coming to me or to the American public. And so I figured they were sitting in the archives. And so I asked for permission just for those documents, nothing else, to see if I could get them out of the archives. I did this 30 years earlier in my career with Richard Nixon. I had a tip that Ross Perot, who was running for president in 92, had bribed Nixon with $60 million of money, got all these favors from government, and then never delivered the money, stiffed Nixon. And it was in the non-public part of the Watergate collection. And in order to do that, a president has to say, "I authorize John Solomon to go into the Nixon archives and get these documents before their public due date." Donald Trump did something similar. Now, I wasn't I didn't work for him. I wasn't doing work for him. I simply was trying to find documents for the American public. But the reason the raid on Mar-a-Lago and the subsequent case brought by Jack Smith, a prosecutor who has a lot of partisan history inside his record as a prosecutor and as a public speaker, is that in the Kash Patel scenario, the grand conspiracy scenario, it's the most recent of the abuses in a 10-year cycle of weaponization. And one of the things I learned, not because I was the representative of President Trump to the archives for the purpose of looking at those one set of documents, but because I learned this from my sources. And I was the first person to report it. Joe Biden's White House counsel's office sicked the National Archives on the FBI and told them to go get a criminal case started against Donald Trump. This occurs in the spring and summer of, I think it's 2022, if I get my time right. And that's around the time that Joe Biden's own lawyer and legal team is finding out, oh my God, he had all this classified stuff by his Corvette in his office in UPenn. So once again, the weapon of mass distraction, the projection is put into motion. And that is, the sitting Democrat president ordering his law enforcement to investigate his likely opponent in the next election. It follows the pattern, and that's why it's so relevant.
It is, but if I could, is it also possible these documents that have been declassified most recently by Tulsi Gabbard and by the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, and as well as Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Is it possible that these documents were, in fact, part of the documents held at Mar-a-Lago, and they wanted to retrieve them back?
Not that I know of, because if the president had them, I wouldn't have gone through the trouble of going to the National Archives. He had to approve that request. He didn't have them. Listen, if he had them, he would have given to me. And by the way, there would have been no reason not to give them to me, because they were declassified. He declassified them on his last day in office. So it would have been lawful and legal to give them. Now, that said, maybe he didn't have them there. Could that have been one of the things that the government was looking for? We don't know.
They didn't know. Yeah.
They don't know. And so they're trying to scoop them up. That is a possible scenario. I've looked into it. I have not been able to corroborate that yet. But certainly there are people who have that theory. Devin Nunes, former House Intelligence Committee chairman, now the chairman of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, which is a very powerful position for oversight. He says he has some concerns that might have been their motive. Whatever the case is, there's plenty of evidence that what happened leading up to the raid and then Jack Smith's prosecution was unlawful. We know the judge in the case ruled that Merrick Garland had no reason to name Jack Smith special prosecutor. It was an unlawful appointment. Now, Merrick Garland's a pretty careful guy. He was a judge for a long time. It's not possible he didn't know his own rules when he appointed Jack Smith a partisan. We know now that the White House sicked the National Archives on the FBI to get Donald Trump in trouble right around the time Joe Biden realized he had a problem. Yeah. So we don't need the Russia documents to be a predicate for that to be related. It's the same pattern involving many of the same people. And I think at the end of the day, that if they go down that path, the most likely location for the grand jury that charges everybody could be in Florida, because that's where the last acts of the alleged conspiracy are.
Well, that's the next step in this extraordinary story that John Solomon has been on top of since day one. And John, thank you for bringing us up to speed. And
very nice to be with you.
A further conversation as this develops, because Lord knows it ain't over yet. Thank you,
It
John.
ain't over. Thanks, Larry.
That is John Solomon, justthenews.com, where, strangely enough, he just focuses on the news and he follows it no matter where it goes. We like that about him. That's what we try to do here, too.